Hi everybody, it's Dr. Osborne. This will be my last video for you before summer break begins. It's fitting we end this series by talking about the Scopes trial as it took place in the summer. The 1920s ushered in what we might consider to be the modern age. Electricity became widely available in rural areas. Home appliances became more affordable because of mass production. Radio was being developed. These advances meant that there was good reason for optimism, and yet many were troubled. The Great War had shaken people's faith in morality and commonly held values such as honor and even a belief in God. Secularism, or the belief that religion and institutions, such as the government, should be separate, appeared to be on the rise. Changes in society were occurring rapidly, and the public wasn't sure what to make of it all. No event better illustrates these tensions than the Scopes trial of 1925. You may have heard of the Scopes trial as a debate between science and creationism. It's true that the teaching of evolution was the subject of the trial, but it really reflects how people were grappling with a number of changes taking place in society. Many historians consider the Scopes trial to be the beginning of America's 20th century culture wars. It symbolized many deeply rooted divides within our country. One of these, which you may already know, was between science and religion. Although the war had caused some people to turn away from God, others embraced religion during the 1920s. They looked to Christianity to comfort them in the losses they had suffered. Others were searching for a simpler way of life that Christianity offered. A segment of these people began to subscribe to something called fundamentalist Christianity. They accepted a literal interpretation of the Bible, and they tended to favor local independent churches and ministers over large mainstream denominations. They also opposed Darwinism and communism. Finally, Christian fundamentalism tended to be more popular in the South during the 1920s. Divisions between the North and South still existed, and the publicity surrounding the trial heightened them. Journalists portrayed Southerners as ignorant and backward and in need of Northern experts to educate them. The trial also symbolized the divide between city and country. People living in small towns and rural areas feared the expansion of urban culture. They worried their way of life would disappear. We'll see how all of these debates played out during the course of the trial. Here's the basic sequence of events that led to the trial. In 1925, the state of Tennessee passed a law called the Butler Act. The Butler Act forbade the teaching of any idea that clashed with the account of how the world was created as presented in the first chapter of Genesis. Charles Darwin's books on the origin of species and the descent of man that present the theory of evolution had been in print for over 50 years at the time the Butler Act was passed. However, the author of this piece of legislation was concerned about city values corrupting rural people. Then, the American Civil Liberties Union, or the ACLU, which was based in New York, argued that the Butler Act violated the Establishment of Religion Clause in the First Amendment to the Constitution. They offered to pay the expenses of a teacher who agreed to break this law and to go to jail. As a result, there would be a trial to test the legality of the Butler Act. In other words, the trial asked this question: was this a law that deserved to be enforced? A trial would mean publicity and money for the town that hosted it, and a number of communities in Tennessee wanted the attention the trial would draw. The small town of Dayton was among them. A man named George Rappleyea, who managed a coal and iron company in town, convinced a group of businessmen to cooperate with the ACLU and sponsor the test case in Dayton. Now all they had to do was find a teacher to violate the Butler Act. This group then approached a high school teacher named John T. Scopes. Here's a little background on him. Scopes earned a degree from the University of Kentucky, where he majored in law and minored in geology. He was not an expert in biology. At Dayton's high school in Ray County, he coached football and served as a substitute teacher. He reluctantly agreed to be part of the test case. One day, he substituted in a biology class, and during a review session, he brought up the theory of evolution using a textbook that the State Textbook Commission in Tennessee had already approved. Thus, the event the reporters called the trial of the century began. Scopes' defense was led by a man named Clarence Darrow. Darrow was a famous lawyer, known for his public speaking skills. Prior to this case, he had saved two young men from a death sentence after they murdered a 14-year-old boy. The man who spoke for the prosecution was William Jennings Bryan. Bryan grew up in Salem, Illinois, and attended Illinois College in Jacksonville before moving to Nebraska. He ran for president 3 times and served as Secretary of State under Woodrow Wilson until 1915. Bryan was a religious man and championed the causes of the so-called common man. H.L. Mencken, a notable journalist, represented the media. Mencken was well known for his hatred of the South and of small towns in general. What transpired in the sweltering heat of July 1925 was less of an actual criminal trial and more of a publicity stunt. The defense's goal was to show that Scopes had not broken the law because there was no conflict between evolution and Christianity. It took the position that the Butler Act only barred the teaching of evolution that denied the biblical account of creation. In fact, most of the arguments that Clarence Darrow and William Jennings Bryan made didn't deal with the subject of evolution at all. Darrow realized there were holes in this theory, and so he didn't question Bryan about it. Instead, he interrogated Bryan about such events as Noah's Ark and the Flood and the age of the earth. Fundamentalists like Bryan interpreted the Bible word for word, but Darrow called on academic theologians who held to a much more liberal reading of the Bible. For example, fundamentalists would say that the book of Genesis, when the book of Genesis talks about a day, it means a literal 24-hour day. Darrow's witnesses, however, argued that a day could instead represent a passage of time, even years. Finally, after 8 days of arguments, Darrow suggested that the judge instruct the jury to find Scopes guilty. Remember, the fact that he had broken the Butler Act was never in doubt. Scopes was found guilty and sentenced on July 21st, but due to a legal technicality, his conviction was set aside. In the end, neither side won. Darrow was never able to challenge the law's constitutionality because the case was eventually thrown out. However, Darrow did humiliate Bryan, who died a few days after the trial from complications related to diabetes and exhaustion. The state of Tennessee repealed the Butler Act in 1967. Even though these events happened nearly 95 years ago, the tensions that they exposed, the debate between religion and science, between North and South, and between urban and rural areas are still present today. It's important to be aware of them as they continue to shape our society. That wraps up this video. Thanks for watching. Stay safe and be well.